Good morning and welcome to 10 Years Hence. Today's speaker is David Walker, former Comptroller General of the United States and now President and CEO of the Peterson Foundation in Washington, D.C. Mr. Walker is now free to do what he wasn't able to do while running the Government Accountability Office, advocate for specific solutions, work proactively with grantees and other partners to build strong coalitions, and encourage and engage in grassroots efforts to bring pressure on Washington to act. As Comptroller General of the United States and head of the Government Accountability Office from 1998 to 2008, spanning both Democratic and Republican administrations, David served as the federal government's chief auditor. Appointed by President Bill Clinton and confirmed unanimously by the U.S. Senate, he was an outspoken, nonpartisan advocate for addressing the major fiscal and sustainability challenges facing the country. He also enacted transformational reforms at the agency and within the accountability profession. Prior to his appointment to run the GAO, Walker served as a partner and global managing director of Arthur Andersen LLP and in several government leadership positions, including as a trustee for Social Security and Medicare from 1990 to 1995, and as Assistant Secretary of Labor for Pension and Welfare Benefit Programs during the Reagan administration. Although no longer the U.S. government's chief auditor, Mr. Walker continues to serve as a global accountability expert as chairman of the United Nations Independent Audit Advisory Committee. He also serves on the boards of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget and the Partnership for Public Service. He holds a degree in accounting from Jacksonville University, a senior management in government certificate in public policy from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, and a number of honorary degrees. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome David Walker.
How about that? Well, there we go. I can even hear myself now. That's good news. What you didn't say, which is very important to know, especially being here at Notre Dame, is that I am a practicing Roman Catholic. And that there's a lot of Roman Catholics, but there's not as many practicing Roman Catholics as there used to be. And that my son and my daughter-in-law went to the Notre Dame of the East, otherwise known as Villanova University. And that I'm pleased and proud to have underneath my clothing a crucifix that was blessed by John Paul II, which I have never taken it off even to take a shower since I received it a number of years ago. So it's great to be at Notre Dame. You know, I was here last time in January of 2007. And I would love to tell you that things have improved dramatically since January of 2007. But since I'm in the truth business, I won't tell you that, because the fact of the matter is it has not. Just so you know from the outset, so you can decide where you want to put me, I am a political independent. Early in life, I was something called a conservative Democrat. That's on the endangered species list. Then I became a moderate Republican. That's also on the endangered species list. I decided that neither one of the parties had a monopoly on the best candidates and best ideas, so I became a political independent in 1997. And quite frankly, I'm pretty happy with that. And a growing number of Americans are becoming that way as well. So what I'm going to try to do is to talk to you about where I think the country is, what are some of the challenges that we face, and what are some of the things that we need to do to address those challenges. And depending upon whether and to what extent we are willing to step up to the plate and make some tough choices both as a society and as individuals, then it will have a profound effect on what the future will be like, both for the United States and its position in the world, and for Americans and American families. Because I believe this country is at a critical crossroads. And I believe that the decisions that are made or that fail to be made within the next several years will have a profound effect in determining whether or not our best years are ahead of us or whether or not they're behind us. And let me tell you why. The United States is a great country, probably the greatest in the history of mankind. I'm fortunate to be from a line that came to this country in the 1680s. I have ancestors who fought and died in the American Revolution. I'm an officer in the Sons of the American Revolution, so I care very deeply about the Constitution, our founding principles, what America is all about. But the simple truth is, America has strayed greatly from the principles and values under which this country was founded and that made this country great. And that we need to recognize that reality and find our way back home in order to try to help make sure that we put ourselves on a more positive path for the future. And let me give you several examples. At the outset of our republic, on March 4th, 1789, the federal government represented 2% of the national economy. Before the recession, before the bailouts, before the stimulus efforts, before the bottom fell out in the last several months, the federal government represented 20.5% of the economy, so over 10 times what it did at the founding of the republic, and it was headed for 30% plus on autopilot before recent events. At the beginning of the republic in 1789, the founders envisioned that the power belonged to the people. That's why it starts off with "we the people" of the United States, the three most powerful words of the Constitution. The founders also believed that government does best when it's closest to the people, that to the maximum extent possible, more government authority ought to be given to local and state governments, and that the federal government should only do those things that the state and local governments cannot do or cannot do effectively because of the nature of the activity, and that we should not expect the private sector to do because the private sector has a duty of loyalty to their shareholders, not to the country, not to the greater good. And so there are things that it's unrealistic to expect them to do, nor would we ever want them to do, even though they play an important role in our society. So at the beginning of our republic, the founders had an idea of what the federal government should do that the states couldn't do. National defense, foreign policy, treasury functions, federal judiciary, Congress of the United States, executive office of the president, postal service. These were the main functions of the federal government in 1789, and they represented 100% of federal spending. That plus interest on the federal debt. And at the beginning of our republic, we had debt equal to 40% of our economy. That was to win our freedom. And the founders were really concerned about that level of debt. I'll come back to that. Well, today, rather than 100% of the federal budget being focused on the express and enumerated responsibilities the founders envisioned, it's less than 40%. And it's going down. Government has expanded in ways far beyond what the founders envisioned. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that's all bad. It's just to give you a sense as to how far we've come from the founding of the Republic. At the beginning of the Republic, George Washington, and my wife and I live on land that he used to own in Mount Vernon. George Washington cautioned us not to involve ourselves in foreign conflicts. And yet, within the last several years, for the first time in the history of the United States, our country engaged in preemptive war. And the Congress did not declare war. In fact, the Congress has not declared war, which only it has the power to do, since the end of World War II. And yet, last time I checked, we've had a number of major conflicts that have cost tens of thousands of lives and hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars since World War II. When you invade a foreign nation, no matter how good the reason might be, no matter what you think of their leaders, you must declare war. And Congress has failed to do that several times. If you look at the beginning of our republic, we valued thrift. We valued savings. We valued personal responsibility. And we had debtors' prisons. If you did not pay your debts, you went to prison. Today, both America as a country and too many Americans are addicted to debt. Spending more money than they make, charging it to the national credit card or individual credit cards, mortgaging the future. And today, bankruptcy is a strategy. Rather than being a taint, rather than being viewed as failure, it is viewed as an active strategy on behalf of some corporations and individuals in order to walk away from their obligations and push the restart button. Today, rather than at the beginning of our republic, where our founders were very concerned about taking on debt, and where when we had debt equal to 40% of our economy, it was well worthwhile because it caused us to win our independence as a nation. Today, our total debt, public and trust fund, is over 75% of GDP. It'll be 85% of GDP before the end of this year, and it's going up dramatically. From 1789 until the 1980s, this country only ran deficits and accumulated debt when we were at war, we had depressions, major recessions, or a national emergency. Since the 1980s, America and Americans became addicted to two things: conspicuous consumption and debt. People wanted it all. They wanted it now. They didn't want to pay for it, and they borrowed for it. So we now are in a situation where running deficits and accumulating debt is happening in good times and bad, in wartime and peacetime, no matter what the circumstances are. No one, including the United States of America, can spend more money than you make indefinitely without having severe adverse consequences over time. In the last 8 years, we've gone from $5.6 trillion in debt to, as of today, about $10.8 and climbing dramatically. That's in 8 years. But the problem is not that level of debt, it's the off-balance sheet obligations. And when you add the off-balance sheet obligations, the unfunded promises for Medicare, $36 trillion, Social Security, $7 trillion, unfunded pensions and retiree health care for military and civilian, and other miscellaneous items, as of September 30, 2008, the number was $56.4 trillion, 4 times the size of the economy, $184,000 per person, $483,000 per family, and median household income in America is only about $48,000. So the typical American family, unknowingly, because of existing government policies and past and practices, had a second or third mortgage of 10 times their annual income, but no house to back that mortgage. All they had is their citizenship, which gives them an unparalleled opportunity to maximize their potential if they have a good education, if they work hard, if they have a positive attitude, if they have solid moral and ethical values. If you have all of those things, you have unlimited potential still in this country. If you don't, things are going to be tough and get tougher over time. And thank God you're at Notre Dame, because you'll be able to get more than one of those just by the fact that you're at Notre Dame. So we have a situation where at the beginning of the Republic, our founders believed that people should leave their regular jobs in the real world, whether it be lawyer, whether it be farmer, whether it be merchant, whether it be physician, whatever it might be. You leave your regular job in the real world and you go to Washington for a short period of time in order to do public service. To where today, too many politicians view their position as a job and they want to make a career out of it. And that's a problem. We've gone from where at the beginning of the Republic, our founders were skeptical of political parties. They viewed them as factions, otherwise known as special interest. And they were concerned that those factions or special interests, if they were allowed to become strong, might create an environment where the duty of loyalty to the party would trump the duty of loyalty to the public interest. Can you believe that? These were visionary people. We had way more than our fair share of great leaders in 1789, and unfortunately today I think we have way less than our fair share of great leaders in 2009, and hopefully that will change. We've gone from a circumstance in which our society believed in individual opportunity and personal responsibility and public morality to where too many people believe they're entitled to things merely because they're in this country. And just look at the television and you'll see what's happened to public morality. We've gone from a time where at the beginning of this republic, people were very positive about the future. People had great hope about the future. People believed that the future was going to be better for our children and our grandchildren and future generations of Americans, and that should be continued over time. The American dream is not owning a house. That is a false premise. The American dream, I would respectfully suggest, is two things. From an individual standpoint, it is each individual's ability to have the opportunity to maximize their potential based upon their God-given talents, consistent with the principles that I articulated before. So it's individual opportunity and liberty combined with a collective responsibility. A collective responsibility as a generation, as a society, to not just leave the country better off, but to leave it better positioned for the future. Ladies and gentlemen, the American dream is at risk. Because what is happening today, and especially you young people, because of current federal policies and practices, your future is being mortgaged big time. And at the same point in time, the relative investments in your future are being reduced dramatically. We're adding debt levels at record rates. That will carry additional interest service costs, which have to be met on a recurring basis. And guess who's going to pay the bill? Furthermore, the percentage of the budget that is being allocated to the past and to consumption has grown dramatically. The percentage of the budget, and by the way, is on autopilot. And the percentage of the budget allocated to children, allocated to research and innovation, allocated to other critical infrastructure needs that help to improve the economy has gone down dramatically. So the future is being mortgaged and relative investments in the future are being cut. You cannot spend and borrow your way to prosperity. You cannot do that as an individual. You cannot do that as a country. And we as a society and we as individuals need to understand that. Now, I say that, I'm not a hypocrite. I have not one dime of debt. I don't have a mortgage. I don't have a car loan. I don't have a credit card balance. And I haven't for 10 years. And it's not always been that way. Because when I first came out of college, I was fortunate. My father paid for my college. I worked part-time, then I worked full-time immediately. I got married at 19 years of age. I've been married to the same woman for 37 years. The fact of the matter is that, we made prudent use of credit. The only time I had a credit card was for accounting and cash flow. I never had a credit card balance. That's the highest form of financing you can take, other than these quickie paycheck loans. Now we're in a situation where people not only have college debt, they have credit card debt, they have debt for many other things, including cars. And don't get me wrong, I had a loan for my first few cars. I couldn't pay cash. Yes, I had a mortgage for my homes for a length of time. But basically, I got to the point where I said that once I could pay off my debts, I did. And as a result, I can never be underwater. My net worth can never be negative. I may not be the richest person in the world from the standpoint of tangible assets, nor do I care to be, quite frankly. But I can sleep better at night. And I can speak with authority when I talk to my children and my grandchildren and others about the need to be prudent with regard to having a budget, with regard to saving and investing, with regard to prudent use of credit. And I can tell you, it's shocking to me that when I go to some of these gourmet coffee shops, and I won't mention any names, all right? When I go to these gourmet coffee shops, I'm the only person in line paying cash. Now, there are a number of people that use debit cards, but there's a lot of people that use credit cards. And I'm sure all those balances don't get paid off every month. So the real cost of that gourmet coffee is a lot higher. We need, as a country and as a society and as individuals, to be able to differentiate between when do you use debt as an investment and when do you use debt to finance conspicuous consumption. It should not be used for conspicuous consumption, period. Period. Zippo. Nada. It should be used for investment, and that means education, a primary residence, your a car, things that are based on true needs. And we as a country and us as individuals need to try to be able to do a better job of that if we want our future to be better than the past. And we have to save. The United States has the lowest savings rate of any industrialized nation. Up until recently, we had 0 to negative savings. What I mean by that, people spent more than they made, more than they took home. All right? Now, the problem with that is, why is savings important? Because with savings comes investment. With investment comes research and development. With research and development comes innovation, productivity improvements, comes quality enhancements, comes growth in the economy, comes improvement in our competitive posture, comes improvement in our standard of living. So we have to save as a country. We have to save as individuals if we want our future to be better than our past. Now, there's a silver lining with all the bad news recently, and that is Americans have started to save again because they're scared. Because many Americans know for the first time what a rainy day looks like. And hopefully Americans now know that when you end up spending more money than you make and you have too much debt, that bad things can happen. Because look at what's happened to some of the financial institutions that many people thought were too big to fail. Look at what's happened to the auto companies. Look at what's happened to a number of other institutions that had names that people thought these institutions are just too big to fail. But they didn't follow prudent practices with regard to innovation, with regard to their cost, with regard to their financing, and as a result, they either went out of business or they required a government bailout. By the way, government has no money. Government can't bail out anybody. You're bailing them out. And guess where we're getting the money from? China, Japan, oil-producing nations. This country is being mortgaged to foreign lenders. This country increasingly is at risk of being held hostage to financial warfare because we are over-reliant on foreign lenders. We must get our savings rate up to try to create a better future, to reduce our reliance on foreign lenders, because if we can't keep our own financial house in order, then eventually that will hurt our economy, that will hurt our international standing, that will hurt our national security, that will hurt our standard of living, that will hurt our domestic tranquility. We are betting the ranch. And we need to make sure that we do the right thing, not just to get through the current crisis, which we will. This is not the big one. We must avoid the big one. Now, let me clarify what I mean by that. Yes, we're in a recession. And we don't know how long it's going to last, and we don't know how deep it's going to be. And it's a global recession. And it's not just a business cycle. You know, nobody repealed a business cycle. There are things called business cycles. But we're facing some other things that are unprecedented. We're facing a problem with regard to financial services and with regard to credit, with regard to housing. We're facing a problem as it relates to the ripple effect of these things. And as a result, we're going to have to spend money in order to try to get the economy moving again, and in order to try to address some of these unprecedented challenges. Now, frankly, we need to be smarter about how we're spending the money, because a lot of the money that's being spent right now by Washington is not timely, targeted, and temporary, and it doesn't have adequate controls to make sure the money is going to be put to good use. Washington talks about we need more transparency, we need more accountability, but all that's after the money's been spent. It's not good enough. You need to have your objectives, your criteria, your controls in place before the money goes out the door, because once the money goes out the door, it is G-O-N-E, gone. And you can have all the transparency and all the accountability you want, and all you're going to have is more frustration. Think of TARP, Troubled Asset Relief Program. We, collectively, spent $350 billion. What did we get for it? What we're told is that it would have been worse had we not done it. You can't prove a negative. And if it was so good, then you ought to be able to prove a positive. Well, why did we have that problem? Because we didn't have clearly defined objectives. We didn't have criteria as to who was going to get the money and on what basis. We didn't have conditions about what they had to do with the money, what they couldn't do with the money. And as a result, after $350 billion, we don't know if we got anything. And yet, we're in danger of repeating the same mistakes, because we haven't laid out clearly defined objectives, criteria, conditions, and to have non-political people involved in making those decisions to protect the taxpayer's interest. Non-political people, professionals who know when to say no. That's got to change. We face a number of major sustainability challenges. Our fiscal policy, our health care policy, our tax policy, our Social Security policy, our policy with regard to energy, the environment, education, foreign relations, Iraq, all these are unsustainable on their present course. And so we must make different course corrections in order to try to deal with it. If I can, let me give you an analogy that you might be able to relate to because of the timeliness of it. We all know the effects of the so-called mortgage-related subprime crisis. Housing. The four factors that caused the mortgage-related subprime crisis, or among the four, there are more than four, the four of the factors that caused the subprime crisis exist for the federal government's finances. And let me explain them to you. In the mortgage situation, there was a disconnect between the people who were issuing the mortgages and who were making origination fees and got paid just by issuing the mortgage, and the people who actually held the mortgage bore the risk and suffered the loss if the mortgage wasn't paid. And you had circumstances in which people gave mortgages to people that didn't have the ability to repay them. And they were making the mortgage based upon the fact that the house price would continue to go up, not the creditworthiness of the borrower. And so as a result, when housing prices went down, when interest rates went up, you had a situation where the person who had the loan couldn't afford to pay it. And that sets off a ripple effect. So a disconnect between the people who benefited from issuing those, made all the fees, and the people who bore the risk because those loans were sold and securitized. And a bunch of people had them. They didn't even know what they had. The other problem you have with that, when you don't have a bank or a single lender you're dealing with, who do you renegotiate with? Who do you call? The second issue, transparency. There was not adequate transparency with regard to the nature and extent and the magnitude of the related risk. And as a result, a lot of people had very big and bad surprises, negative surprises. Thirdly, too much debt. Not enough focus on cash flow and over-reliance on credit ratings. And fourthly, a failure of both private sector and government risk management oversight mechanisms to act in the face of clear and compelling increased risk until we had a crisis. That's the mortgage situation. Let me describe the federal government. The disconnect. Today's taxpayers benefit from low-tax, high-spend policies. You will pay the price and bear the burden. Transparency. The problem is not the current deficits and debt, although they're bad and they're a problem and they're troubling. The problem is our off-balance sheet obligations. $40+ trillion that grow by $3 trillion a year on autopilot, even with a balanced budget. Thirdly, too much debt. I think that's self-evident. Medicare is already negative cash flow. Social Security is going to be negative cash flow within 10 years. Right now, the United States has a AAA credit rating for now. That won't last if we don't demonstrate that we can get our own financial house in order. And last, look what happened with TARP. Look what's happened in the recent things. Did Washington anticipate these problems? Did they react when you had the circumstances where a number of risk factors started and warning signs started going off in May of 2007? No. Washington waited until there was a crisis at its doorstep, and then it acted. Washington is a lag indicator. Washington demonstrated laggardship. That's on Wikipedia. Please use it so it'll stay on there. I put it on there. Let me explain to you what laggardship is. All right? Let me explain to you what it is. Hopefully we know what leadership is. Let me define leadership. Leadership is getting things done with and through others. But here's what leadership is. It's looking ahead, seeing the trends, identifying the challenges and opportunities, and taking affirmative, proactive steps to capitalize on the opportunities, to mitigate the risk, and to avoid crises with and through others. That's what leadership is. Now, let me explain to you what laggardship is. Laggardship is not looking ahead, not seeing the trends, not identifying the opportunities and the challenges, not taking steps to mitigate risk, waiting until a crisis is at your doorstep, doing something and calling it leadership. That's laggardship. We have too much laggardship, not enough leadership, not just in government, but quite frankly in the private sector as well. As Lee Iacocca said in his book, "Where have all the leaders gone?" That's the title of his book, and I commend it to you. It's a very short book. It's a very quick read, and I commend it to you. It came out about 1.5 years ago. So we have some lessons to learn from the recent failures. The too big to fail concept has been proven wrong over and over again. You know, when things are going well and Washington is at a stalemate, That's not all bad. Because sometimes, be careful, listen to what I'm saying here, sometimes Washington can muck things up. That started with an M for the... Sometimes they can, all right? But when things aren't going well, and they're getting worse with the passage of time on autopilot, and Washington is at stalemate, that's a disaster. And so we need policy, operational, political reforms in order to shake Washington up, in order to be able to make it more representative of the people, in order to make it more leadership-oriented rather than laggardship-oriented. And we can do that. But for us to do that, the first three words of the Constitution have to come alive. We the people. We the people are responsible and accountable for what does or does not happen in Washington, and in the state capitol, and in City Hall. And so if things aren't going well, look in the mirror. And young people in particular have a disproportionate opportunity and a disproportionate interest because you're going to get the bill. Your tax burdens will double. Your discretionary income will be cut in half in the prime working years of your life. And it'll get worse after that. That's basic math. If we don't start confronting some of our challenges soon. I'm going to attend on Monday with less than 100 people, senators, members of the House, and not others. Less than 100 of us are going to be at the White House with President Obama for a fiscal responsibility summit. President Obama has talked about the need to get our own house in order. He's talked about the need to try to achieve a grand bargain of Social Security reform, health care reform, tax reform, budget control, spending reprioritization constraints, and he's right, we need to do that. The question is how we're going to do it and when we're going to do it. And so we are pushing from the foundation, I'm pushing individually and have been for a while, that we need to create a process where everything is on the table, all those things I mentioned and more, that will go outside of Washington's Beltway, which is not the real world. By the way, my home is outside the Beltway. That will go outside of Washington, which is not the real world. That will engage the American people through town hall meetings, that will leverage digital technologies, the Internet, in ways they've never been leveraged before for public policy issues, that will listen to the American people, help educate and engage the American people, and that will come back and make a range of budget, tax, Social Security, health care, spending, and other reform proposals that will be presented to the Congress for an up or down vote. It's time to hold these people accountable. I'm hoping that we can gain some momentum on Monday for some type of a proposal like this, and we are going to engage in a timely, temporary, and targeted, does that sound familiar? That's supposed to be what stimulus is. Timely, temporary, and targeted advertising, print, and television campaign to try to increase the likelihood that will happen. If you watch any one of the major Sunday public policy programs this week, watch for our 30-second ad from the Peterson Foundation. I'll describe it to you. My wife and I went to Antarctica because it was the last continent that we hadn't been to. And because my wife was afraid it was going to melt and go away, I told her, babe, it's a continent. Yeah, it's got a lot of ice, but, you know, it's a continent. All right? I saw a lifetime full of penguins and icebergs. And coming back from that, the iceberg concept just seemed to fit. Because everybody today is focused on the portion of the iceberg that's our immediate challenge, that's above the water and visible. But our real problem, the problem that threatens the ship of state, is below the water. It's the off-balance sheet things that you don't see. It's the sustainability challenges that threaten our future that we may not feel today, but they do threaten our future. And so, yes, we need to do what we have to do to turn the economy around and deal with the immediate crisis, but we also have to take steps to be able to deal with those much larger and more threatening challenges. And so we have print ads and television ads focused on an iceberg theme to try to get people to act before we have a crisis, because the big one would be a super subprime crisis, a loss of confidence by foreign lenders in the ability of the United States to get its own financial house in order, a flight from the dollar, charging much higher interest rates to loan us money, and believe me, the ripple effect of that would not be pretty. And it wouldn't start with an R. It'd start with a D. And it would be global. We must not allow that to happen. And we can avoid that, but only if we wake up, recognize reality, not just focus on today, start taking steps to create a better tomorrow. And I'll close, and you can ask me questions on all the details. Yes, we can reform our budget system to make sure that it's more prudent and that we don't continue to mortgage your future. Yes, we can reform Social Security to make it solvent, sustainable, secure, and more savings-oriented. Yes, we can reform our health care system to control costs to keep from bankrupting America while meeting essential needs of society and avoiding unlimited wants that could bankrupt this country. Yes, we can reform our tax system to make it simpler, to help it make it fairer, to make it more competitive, and to be able to help make sure that we generate enough future revenues to pay our current bills and to deliver on the promises that the government intends to keep. Yes, we can rebase government and separate between which programs and tax policies are working and which ones aren't, terminate the ones that aren't or cut back and add more for ones that are, and invest more in our future. Yes, we can. But we cannot do all of these without presidential leadership, without extraordinary processes, and without the people demanding change. Real, fundamental change, not incremental change. Incremental change will sink our ship of state. And do not forget history. The Roman Empire is the longest standing empire in the history of mankind. The Roman Empire lasted over 1,000 years. The Roman Empire fell for many reasons. I'll mention 4. Decline in moral values and political civility at home. Overconfident and overextended militarily around the world. Fiscal irresponsibility by the central government and inability to control its borders. Do those sound familiar? We must learn from history. We must take steps to deal with large known and growing problems before we pass a tipping point. Yes, we must. Yes, we can. But we need to do it soon. And if we do, our future will be better than our past. And that's what America is all about. Thank you very much. Now, I intentionally didn't go into a lot of details about Social Security reform or tax reform or health care reform or all that kind of stuff because I figured I could answer questions on that or whatever else you want. Because I'd rather maximize the amount of time we have for Q&A. That way I know I'm talking about something at least one of you cares about. So let's open it up for Q&A.
I'm an MBA here, and a lot of us just spent some time in Chile, where they have a public pension system where the money is privately managed and held in individual accounts. Mm-hmm. Would you recommend that sort of transformation of our current Social Security system, or do you think that ours can be tweaked to be made more sustainable?
Well, on my trip to Antarctica, I went through Chile, and I'm very familiar with the Chilean system. Chile is probably in the best shape of any Latin American country financially. They moved from a defined benefit system, which is what the Social Security system is, to a defined contribution system. It's working for them. I don't think it's the answer for us, and let me tell you why. And then I'll tell you what I think the answer might be. When you're talking about retirement income, you have to consider at least 3 sources of income: Social Security, private pensions, and personal savings. Social Security is universal. Private pensions are not. Only about 50% of Americans have a private pension plan. It's been 50% for 4 decades. Why? Because healthcare costs are out of control. And so as a result, employers can't offer pensions. And in the pension side, there are overwhelmingly now defined contribution plans, which is the Chilean system, where you accumulate savings, but you bear the investment risk. If things go well, good. But if they don't, you suffer. All right? On the savings side, we have the lowest savings rate of any industrialized nation on earth. And obviously, the number one form of savings for most Americans was home equity. It may still be, but it's not what it used to be. So therefore, I think the answer for Social Security is something along the following lines. We need to recognize that it is the foundation of retirement income security. It's the only thing that people know that they have for sure. And like a foundation, you ought to build on it, but that foundation needs to be solid. You need to be able to count on it. And if you can't count on it, the whole house can come crumbling down. So we need to reform Social Security to keep it as a base defined benefit system, to encourage people to work longer, to be able to strengthen the benefit for people near the poverty level, to provide somewhat less benefits for middle and upper income, to possibly raise the taxable wage-based cap, but not the tax rate, in other words, the amount of income that you have to pay, and not eliminate it, all right? We need to possibly adjust the cost of living adjustment once you retire modestly. Let's say take off half a point so that everybody is contributing to the solution. If you do those things, you will make the program solvent, sustainable, and secure indefinitely. Indefinitely. On top of that, we should consider adding an automatic payroll deduction, 2 to 3% off the top savings account that goes into a real trust fund with real investments, with real fiduciary responsibility and accountability, like the Chilean system, that would help increase our savings rate, provide a pre-retirement death benefit, provide a supplemental retirement benefit, and provide something for your heirs if you pass before it's all been expended. I think that is, from a policy standpoint and from a political standpoint, because keep in mind, it's got to pass the Senate and the House and be signed into law. And that's what things people have to do. When you're talking about policy changes, you've got to look at the proposal, the process, and the politics. It's got to pass all 3. If it doesn't pass all 3, it won't be successful. Excuse me.
Lecture comparing us to the Founding Fathers, today's government to the Founding Fathers, and numerous examples of how we've gotten worse. Can you give us 1 or 2 examples where you feel like we've made drastic improvements that maybe can help going forward in the future?
Yeah, well, let's face it. I mean, at the beginning of the Republic, we were a fledgling nation. We were focused on ourselves. We didn't really have much of an impact on the rest of the world. I mean, now we're in a situation where we are the leading country, in the world. We're having a major impact in many different ways, economically, culturally, foreign relations, etc., around the world. All right. I think that some of the expansions of government over the years have been appropriate. Not all, but some. I think government does have a role to be able to try to make sure that the disadvantaged are taken care of. And I think that, in many cases, what government has done is it's gone way beyond that. And it's trying to provide entitlement programs, not for the disadvantaged, but for everybody. And in many circumstances, by doing that, I'm sorry, do I need to stay in the middle here? In many circumstances, by doing that, we've created programs that overpromise, underdeliver, and they're unsustainable. So have we had a lot of successes? Absolutely. I mean, we've gone from basically nothing to, at today, the only superpower on earth with economic, social, foreign relations, military, and other power unequal. By the way, that's temporary. There'll be at least one more, maybe two more, within the next 20 years, all right? And we'll be one of them. Okay, we'll still be there, but we're not going to be alone. So yes, okay? But again, my view is, while times change, certain principles and values are timeless, and we need to recognize that reality. We need to go back to some of the basic principles and values that helped us to get where we are. Whoever controls the microphone decides.
Yeah, you talked about your upcoming trip to Washington and about President Obama's supposed commitment to fiscal responsibility. How do you feel about his actual commitment to fiscal responsibility, especially in light of the stimulus package that was recently passed? It's been criticized by Republicans and fiscally conservative Democrats alike for really being the opposite of fiscally responsible, containing a lot of pork and a lot of provisions that don't actually help to stimulate the economy at all, at least in the short run. Okay.
First, let's take the stimulus bill, and I'll just address that. The administration didn't want to call it a stimulus bill. The Congress didn't want to call it a stimulus bill for good reason, because it's not just a stimulus bill. To be stimulus, in my view, it's got to be timely, targeted, and temporary. It should result in infusions in the economy, clearly within a year, hopefully as rapidly as possible. It should result in increasing jobs or preserving jobs. It may involve some temporary extension of existing government benefits, but should not involve an expansion of government benefits. If you analyze the $787 billion bill on those criteria, about a third of it's stimulus. Now, that doesn't mean the other two-thirds are totally without merit. It just means it's not stimulus. It also means that since they got it passed as part of an emergency piece of legislation, they didn't have to make any tough decisions. They didn't have to pay for it. They didn't have to cut spending in other areas or, it just add on, just charge the credit card. All right? So, I think that we needed a stimulus. It would have been better to have a smaller overall price tag in which a vast majority of the money was really stimulus. But that's past tense. So the question is, what do you do going forward? Tough choices are going to have to be made about what to do with the rest of the TARP money. I think there's going to be a TARP 2. Tough choices are going to have to be made about, how to implement the housing proposal. Tough choices are going to have to be made about what to do with additional auto assistance. All right? And I think we're likely to get another stimulus this summer. That maybe it's a real stimulus this time. All right? So my view is that, look, I don't like deficits and debt, but there are times when you have to run deficits and accumulate debt. And I'm less concerned about the fact that we're running deficits and accumulating debt in the current environment, although you want to try to do it better so you minimize the deficits and the debt. I'm more concerned about what's under the water. I'm more concerned about the structural problems that we faced before we went into recession, before we had all these bailouts, and that we haven't done anything about it. And in fact, now they're worse.
I heard a statistic recently that the savings rate in the U.S. last year was 0.3%.
Was what?
Was 0.3%.
Yeah, it would have been negative, but for the fourth quarter, for the end of the year, it went up because people got scared.
Right, but they said that it is currently running about 2.9%.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Personal savings rate.
Which is about 10 times higher.
Yeah, but it should be 8+.
Oh, that's what I was wondering. What level should it? Okay.
I mean, the average savings rate for an industrialized nation is 8+. All right? And we used to run that too. But basically, when you look at all the numbers, what happened was there was a societal change. And this is not a political statement. There was a societal change that you can see happening starting in about the 80s, both at the national level and at the individual level. And you can see it in debt, and you can see it in savings, and you can see it in consumption. I mean, the numbers don't lie. Some people...
You talked about that societal change. Do you think, as far as like we take out these big loans, the big student loans to pay for college, which is an investment and not conspicuous consumption, as you said, but do you think that that's training us to be relatively comfortable with debt, so that even before we enter the workforce, we're used to having some sort of debt load?
Well, first, we have the best post-secondary education system in the world. We're not top 20 in the world in K through 20. We're not top 20. And so you're fortunate being at Notre Dame, because obviously you got out of the K through 12 system. You did well, or you wouldn't be here. All right? And Notre Dame's a great school, and so you got a competitive advantage. All right? And you're probably taking on debt, but that's an investment. Now, frankly, I think higher education is getting more and more expensive, and that's a matter of concern. And I think we have to think as a matter of public policy, what, if anything, can and should be done about that. But I think our biggest problem, quite frankly, is not in the post-secondary, it's the K through 12. If we don't do something to become more competitive there, if we don't do something to deal with the dropout rates there, if we don't do something to not only improve math and science, but frankly also financial literacy and civic responsibility there, that's where I think we're really going to have a bigger challenge.
Talking on retirement age, we've got a life expectancy that is growing every year. How do you feel about that in light of the retirement age staying the same? Is that sustainable?
All right. Well, let's talk about Social Security systems. Does anybody know what what country had the first Social Security system in the Western world? Deutschland, Germany. 1870s. Otto von Bismarck. Brilliant politician. Let me tell you why. Because he made a liberal promise that was fiscally conservative. He said in the 1870s that if you live to 65, the state will provide you a modest pension to help you in those years. What was the average life expectancy? 55. 55, okay? Now, fast forward to 1935. U.S. Social Security system. We picked 65. What was average life expectancy? 65. All right? Fast forward to now. Life expectancy in the upper 70s and going up. What's Social Security? 65 going to 67, but still 62 for early retirement. The answer is the following. The federal government needs to have policies that are affordable and sustainable and that are in the national interest for the country as a whole and for society as a whole. In my view, it is clearly in the country's interest and society's interest to increase the normal and early retirement ages for Social Security gradually over a 20-year period and index it to life expectancy. Why? Not really for fiscal reasons, although that'll help, for economic reasons. Because economic growth is affected tremendously by labor force growth. We need to encourage people to work longer for labor force growth. We're in a knowledge-based economy, not an industrial age. People have an ability to work longer, and we need to encourage them to work longer. That doesn't mean they can't retire early. They can retire whenever they want. But government programs and policies should not encourage people to retire before it's in our broad-based societal interest. Now, for people that are in heavy manufacturing, steel, heavy manufacturing, they may not be able to work as long. Well, we have to have an out for them under the disability program. So you have to recognize that, you have to deal with that. But for a vast majority of our society, they can, they should, and we need them to work longer. Take my boss. He's 82. I had lunch yesterday with Paul Volcker. I think he's 82. Okay? I could, Warren Buffett, the idea of retiring at 62 or 65 today, is really strange. That doesn't mean you got to work 100 hours a week, 7 days a week.
You mentioned earlier in your discussion of Social Security reform about the skyrocketing costs of health care. What changes do you feel should be made to address health care reform, and do you feel a socialized health care system is completely off base?
Health care is our big problem. In basketball parlance, Social Security reform is a layup. It is not a slam dunk, but it's a layup. Health care reform is a three-point play from underneath the opponent's basket at the opposite end of the court. All right? Health care will bankrupt this country under our current path. And that's the path we're on. And we must not allow that to happen. I don't think we will. Okay? We have to take steps to reduce the rate of increase in health care costs. There's a lot of things that can and should be done with regard to Medicare and Medicaid. More competitive bidding. I think we have to think about whether or not prescription drugs ought to be advertised. We're the only industrialized nation that allows that. It fuels demand and cost, and in fact, in some circumstances in which it's not good for the patient. I think we have to look at, Medicare Advantage. That was supposed to save us money. It costs us money. I think we have to look at the subsidies for Medicare. There are 3 Medicare programs. Medicare Part A, which is hospital insurance, funded by a payroll tax, mandatory. Medicare Part B and D, outpatient, physicians, and prescription drugs, voluntary. You don't have to join them. Funded with a premium and general revenues. The premium, on average, is 25%. It makes sense to have a 75% taxpayer subsidy, by the way, debt-financed taxpayer subsidy, 75% taxpayer subsidy. If the person's near poor and not eligible for Medicaid, it makes no sense for me to have a 75% subsidy. Makes no sense. Or for people that are above average income. That's middle and upper class welfare. That's unaffordable. That's unsustainable. But over time, what we have to do is that we have to reform our health care system dramatically to focus on 4 objectives. Universal coverage for basic and essential health care that's affordable and sustainable over time, that avoids taxpayer-funded heroic measures. That's like wellness, preventative, and catastrophic. A budget for what the federal government will spend on health care, because it'll bankrupt us if we don't have a budget. National evidence-based practice standards for the practice of medicine and issuance of prescription drugs to improve consistency, enhance quality, reduce cost, and dramatically reduce litigation risk, and increase personal responsibility and accountability for our own health and wellness. This America, you ought to be able to do whatever you want as long as it's legal, but the taxpayers shouldn't subsidize bad behavior. We subsidize bad behavior big time right now. We have very perverse incentives. And we're going to have to do something about that. And we're going to have to change our tax system, too, on health care. Right now, believe it or not, we lose $250 billion a year in revenues because individuals never pay income taxes or payroll taxes on the value of health care insurance that the employer pays. You never taxed on that. All right? Well, guess what? If you're a CEO for a private sector company, probably have a very good health plan, better than the rank and file employees, and you're in your top marginal tax bracket, that means the taxpayers are subsidizing your health care big time. If, on the other hand, you're near poor, not eligible for Medicaid because you're working in small business, have no health care, you get no taxpayer subsidy. That makes no sense. No sense. All right? That's an example of how the government, rather than dealing with a broad-based societal need and targeting its efforts to help those that need help and doing it in a way that avoids perverse incentives and is affordable and sustainable over time, that's what we need to do. Now, socialized medicine, I'm not for. By that I mean, if you mean the federal government managing the health care system, the federal government can't manage itself. I mean, it would be a nightmare. I mean, it would be an absolute nightmare. I mean, you want this group managing our health care system? I rest my case.
I'll just speak loudly. You've talked about health reform, Social Security reform. What about tax reform?
Okay, that's fair. Well, first, before the recession, before the bailouts, before the stimulus, we were getting tax revenues of 18.5% of the economy, and we were spending at about 20.5% of the economy. So we had a gap of about 2%. All right? It's worse now, okay? But that's what it was, all right? 2%, we can deal with that, indefinitely. But it's headed for big double-digit numbers and climbing, all right? What we need to do on tax reform is several things. A, we've got to streamline it. We've got to simplify it. We've got to make it more competitive internationally. We need to also raise enough revenue where we can pay our current bills and deliver on future promises. I think the most likely type of health care reform that we'll see is as follows. A broader-based income tax, so you eliminate or cut back on a lot of exemptions and deductions and, broader base, so more things get taxed to keep rates as low as possible. Not a flat rate, but maybe fewer brackets to, still progressive income tax. You don't want to increase payroll taxes because that's the most progressive tax at all. But we need to do something that to encourage savings and to recognize the change in wealth distribution in our society. Believe it or not, the poorest people in our country are children. The wealthiest people in our country on average are seniors. On average, all right? So we need to recognize that we need to have more of a consumption-based tax system. And that consumption-based tax might end up, could be a national sales tax or whatever else, but it would probably be dedicated to health care. Now, from an intellectual standpoint, we'd be much better off just to have a consumption tax, get rid of the income tax, get rid of the payroll tax. We'd be much better off. Much better off, okay? But politically, I don't know if you could ever get there.
David, while you're on the subject of taxes, there's been a little publicity lately about tax cheats, about the names of people with Swiss bank accounts, people who simply don't pay their fair share, but in terms of corporations as well. Consulting firms like Accenture that are incorporated in the Bahamas or the Caymans. What's your view about getting the $250 billion a year that people evade?
Well, I do think that we need tax reform to try to be able to close some loopholes and to address some perverse incentives on the corporate side. I do think that there's a lot of tax planning and engineering that goes on that the government is just outgunned about, that can't monitor and stay on top of. But I will say this. You have to keep in mind that the private sector is the engine of growth and innovation in our economy, in particular small business, all right? That corporations have duties of loyalty to their shareholders, not to a country. And therefore, our corporate tax system has to be competitive globally because corporations will move. And in fact, a lot of things that people are concerned about right now is to what extent do you have corporations that are creating jobs or moving jobs overseas? That's just the tip of the iceberg. The more important point is to what extent do corporations create jobs overseas that were never in America and will never be in America because of tax differentials, regulatory differentials, or whatever. So there are things that we need to do to try to make sure that people are complying with the law and that we are generating adequate revenues from the corporate sector. At the same point in time, I think if you look forward, in the end you need to understand that individuals ultimately bear the tax burdens. They ultimately bear the tax burdens, all right? And most Americans kind of like America. You know, most Americans really don't want to go anyplace else. And so we've got less of a problem with, people fleeing, on that front. And so, yes, we've got to crack down on some of these things, but we've got to stay competitive, because if we don't stay competitive, then we're going to have bigger problems.
Could you speak a little bit about your foundation website?
Okay, then.
The role of citizens and personal responsibility.
Good. This legitimizes me to give you an ad. Okay? The Peter G. Peterson Foundation, we're based in New York. We're less than a year old. We are focused on trying to help promote more responsibility and accountability today in order to create more opportunity tomorrow. We want to keep America great and the American dream alive. That's what we're trying to do. It's a fairly heavy lift. We're focusing on national economic responsibility and personal financial responsibility. Our website is pgpf.org. pgpf.org. I would also commend to you the movie site. We own a movie. We gave away 30 minutes of it for free. It is at I.O.U.S.A, themovie.com. And send it to anybody and everybody you know, because it provides in fact-based, nonpartisan, non-ideological, clear and compelling terms where we are, the need for action. It's got great graphics. It's got Democrats, Republicans, and Independents, and it's won a number of awards. Been on television on CNN, been on BBC, being shown around the world. But we gave away 30 minutes of it for free, if you will. Bottom line, in order for the tough choices to be made, the people are going to have to demand it. And they're going to have to hold people accountable if they fail to do it. Because we now have career politicians. And they're very focused on wanting to get reelected. And when you want to get reelected, you generally don't want to tell people the truth. And you generally don't want to talk about things you don't have answers to. And you generally don't want to end up limiting spending, restructuring benefits, and raising taxes. Most people don't like that. We're going to have to do some of all of that. And the sooner we recognize that reality, the better. But how you go about it matters. Because I got to tell you, there's huge amounts of waste in Washington. Huge! And so that's why we've got to really re-baseline government, too. And President Obama is right about that, too. But then my question to President Obama is, how are you going to do it? How are you going to do it? You know, saying you want to do something is one thing, but how are you going to do it, and when are we going to do it?
Another question. One more. What's your view of tax cuts as a stimulus component?
All tax cuts are not created equal. Some tax cuts stimulate the economy, other tax cuts don't. They're social policy. Debt finance tax cuts are not tax cuts. They're deferred tax increases. If you're going to do tax actions that are designed to stimulate, they have to encourage economic activity or cause economic activity quicker that otherwise might not occur or wouldn't occur till later. Therefore, if you're going to do a tax cut, if they're geared more towards business where you're giving a full deduction for things, if you do it within a certain amount of time, they're geared more towards people who are likely to spend it, versus people who have discretionary income. That's obviously going to have more of an impact. But again, If it's a debt finance tax cut, it's a deferred tax increase. All right? And so it might help you in the short term, but it's going to hurt you over time. Keep in mind this. Since 2002, when the federal budget controls expired, that's when Washington really lost control. All right? We've had debt-financed wars, debt-financed entitlement expansions, Medicare Part D, debt-financed spending increases, debt-financed tax cuts. Johnson got criticized for guns and butter. We're doing guns, butter, and tax cuts, all debt-financed. The numbers don't work. And so therefore, some people argue, well, gee, if revenues went up, so that proves the tax cuts work. That's bunk. Okay? Revenues are going to go up because the economy grows. Revenues are going to go up because people go into higher tax brackets because of inflation. Revenues go up because of inflation. Okay? So the idea that revenues go up is not dispositive. Okay? Most economists will tell you that you recover part of the loss of taxes through economic activity. Well, we don't recover all of it. All right? And so it's a timing difference to a certain extent, Thank you.
David? On behalf of the students and faculty of the Mendoza College of Business, thank you so much.